Thank you very much, Angelika and Julia, for the kind invitation and the kind introduction. Yes, I am now a professor of pedagogy, but be assured I've never done a course in pedagogy in my whole life. I'm a theologian by training, so this might qualify me to speak about Bayesian philosophy of science, since you know that the Reverend Thomas Bayes was a theologian and maybe a mathematician too, but this is nothing I can admit for myself that I'm very good in maths. So my lecture is basically on mixed methods, and this is a topic that has actually jumped on me during my PhD, because I was I was dealing with a field that is notoriously understudied, and if studied, with very, very few observations, so participants, so small studies, and mine was no exception. So when I was trying to find out how to still make a good contribution to science, I thought I need to, look a little bit further and develop my own stance, my own philosophical stance to approach empirical research. This is how I was trained, and this is what I try to do now, and this is what I'm actually also focusing in my research. So I'm, maybe an educational researcher with a lot of curiosity in the field of mathematical psychology. So let's see if you're happy with what I'm going to tell you. So when I'm talking about crossover, so the crossover of qualitative and quantitative approaches, I'm very much drawing on one author on paper. Now it's my turn to try me in South African Dutch. So Hitchcock is easy to pronounce, but Onwubusi, Onwubusi, maybe I'm getting there. One of the most cited and most profound professors in mixed method research, Cambridge professor. So I'm trying to follow their line of argumentation. I present it and follow it, and I think at one point I'm diverging into the Bayesian tradition, which is not at all in their scope, which surprises me, because for me this is just a natural idea to conceptualize mixed method research in a Bayesian tradition. Why this is so, we will find out in a small epistemological intermezzo I will give you after I present you some of the techniques and methods I have used in my own research that still fit into the framework presented in classical crossover mixed method research. And after that intermezzo, I think we can go a little deeper and try to understand complex designs that transcend the classical framework of crossover mixed method research. And I hope to convince you that this is a viable and reasonable way to do. So some concepts. When we talk about traditions in research, this is mostly connected or divided into qualitative and quantitative research. And those two traditions, this dichotomy expresses itself in a worldview and in an ontology researchers hold. So ontology is basically the Greek way of saying what the world is about. Ontos, to ontos is the being, and logi is the speaking of the being. So when we talk about what the world really is and how we have access to the world, this is ontology. And it is very rarely made explicit. Researchers do not talk about ontology. They hold the theory chapters in publications, in paper publications. They do not ask for it. We tacitly hold it for granted that we all have a common worldview in science, and that when we talk about evidence, we mean evidence that is something, the case out there in the world. So we're talking about states of the world without questioning our access to those. This is something that is never questioned in quantitative research, but it is quite often questioned in qualitative research, if not explicitly, but so implicitly, at least in the textbooks and in the philosophy of science courses. And so one question is, how do these different worldviews go together when we mix the traditions in research, in one research project? So far for the tradition. If we go one step lower and talk about approaches, so we speak of systems of data that are linked to designs that are combined or not combined. So an approach would be a little lower than tradition. And when we talk about methods, we speak of systems of techniques, so data analysis, which are part of an approach. And techniques is a single step, a procedure in a data analysis. So let's have this hierarchy of concepts in mind, because we will see that on the different levels, we need different, different foundations or different epistemologies connected to it. So when we talk about mixed methods, it's basically we mix methods or techniques or approaches from the qualitative and the quantitative domains or approaches, traditions. And the classical way to name those or to describe those is qual, standing for qualitative, and quan for quantitative. And the most simple combination in the mixing is a parallel approach expressed by a plus. So you do interviews and you do a questionnaire, and then you analyze the interviews and you analyze the questionnaire, and then you might draw some conclusions from that. You might also say, okay, the interviews are much more substantial than the questionnaires. So you can express this in just having the minuscule q for the quan, and vice versa, of course. A little bit more advanced mixing would be a sequential design, where you say, okay, I have interviews, and from the interviews, I derive information maybe that I can quantify, or maybe contextualize with quantifications of something, then you would have maybe a minuscule q, or the other way around. So sequential is more than parallel insofar as you draw direct implications or conclusions and contextualize the results from the two different analysis approaches more coherently. In multi-level mixed analysis, so don't confuse this with multi-level analysis in statistics. This is now not on a statistical model. This is empirical model we're talking about. But this is how it is called in mixed method research terminology. You can combine different approaches, either parallel, sequential, mix it as you like. So you're building a hierarchy of analytical steps in the course of a research workflow. So this is pretty advanced already and quite complicated in practice. So I've already made the distinction between a statistical model and an empirical model. And this is something I am very eager to teach my students, that there is a distinction. So the empirical model is how we collect the data and how we would describe the workflow. The empirical model would also say what epistemic stance or what epistemic weight we give to the findings once we have them analyzed. So what is this? What is an epistemic weight of a finding? Well, this is just the credibility and the credibility we would assign to a finding, and how far we would go in its generalizing. So are we ready to generalize from observations from 20 interviews, or are we not? And what is the epistemic weight we would give 20 interviews in depth to a survey with 2,000 children? So see, there's a weighing there with both to generalizability of some findings and their thrust to explain things. So maybe we can explain things much better with 20 interviews than we can with data from 2,000 children, where we just have data from a questionnaire, because we don't know what they really think, and we don't know why they crossed 1 or 5 in a Likert scale. We can only statistically test for it. So, and this is something we have to weigh in mixed method research. So we have to level this out. And crossover mixed methods research is basically integrating techniques and methods and approaches from the different traditions. And I give you in a minute some examples from my own research where I have tried to really integrate the quantification in qualitative data. I chose the bow tie operator to express this relationship because it kind of looks nice, it looks cool, but it has also a deeper meaning. In algebra, it's used as the natural join operator, which actually finds commonalities between two class of sets. So I think this is a nice way to put it, but this is something I haven't decided yet and not published. So this is just a private little note, and I use it now for the first time in public, basically. So in this paper, I'm referring to on mixed methods crossover research. They give a nice overview. So this is a direct quote from this paper. I give the references below, I think. I can see it because I have some control panel here. Yes, I give the reference. So it's basically an escalation of complexity from non-complex to complex, from techniques to approaches. So it's a 3x3 matrix, and the complex approaches, this is where we want to be in research. And this is where the problems begin, I think. To to be epistemologically kind of tricky, because there we have the clash of cultures and traditions, which I'm going to explain in a minute. We don't have to go through these examples in detail, just the point what I want to make is that, there's some sort of complexity that is not really problematic. So if you have interview data and you count some words and say, okay, this person has, or count codes, that's maybe a little bit more interesting. So person A talked about code A 5 times, and person B talked about code A 7 times. Thus, we can conclude that person B finds it more interesting to talk about code A than person 1. Though this is a quantification of text that is kind of unproblematic from an epistemological point of view, I would say. But if you go into more complex operations, it gets interesting. So how interesting? Let me give you an example of a technique I used in my dissertation, 2015. We were interested in children or students' readjustment strategies after they returned from 1 year on a sailing vessel. So they went on a boat trip for 1 year, had or half a year, had school lessons on board. It's a school project. And they came back and had to readjust to the real life after they've come right off the Bounty commercial, being a half a year with your peers on a boat in the Caribbean. That's kind of cool, very expensive. So what do they do when they come back? So we made them write letters. And so some have been back just 1 month, and some have been back 4 years. And our intuition was, or my intuition was, that those who had been just come back write a different narrative of their reintegration the last 4 weeks than those who had been there for 4 years. And so we tried to find the codes in the handwritten letters. So they were just asked to write them how they feel and what they're doing and how life is doing for them. And then we quantified that and actually plotted this in a timeline. And we were actually able to express trajectories of a culture shock. So in reverse order, they have kind of a shock experience when they come back. It gets better, it gets even worse, and then it gets better again. So that's one way of mixing techniques. So we used a quantitative technique to express qualitative findings. So classically, one would have had a content analysis and then try to find a narrative, how the adolescents are coping with their reintegration. In another paper, we took the same approach of quantifying text, but this time I designed it in a way that we actually were able to get much more text material done by asking them just for 1 word. So it was about how they experienced teaching, biology teaching, in 2 teaching contexts, indoor and outdoor, and ask them to describe the teaching or their experiences with the teaching with 3 words. And then we ask them to give 3 more words for the first word. So the primary words and the secondary words. So if you wish, this is already a very quantitative approach to generating text. And what we did then was we did an emotion coding of the generated primary words using the secondary words. So if they talked about an iris, the flower, and said it was yellow, it was boring, and it was, yeah, maybe they didn't even find the third word, which was kind of often the case. So we knew, okay, this is the code is subject, and it is negatively connotated because it was a boring thing. If they said, okay, we found an iris, it was cool, it is yellow, and we had much fun, because they're connecting many more things to the iris. This would be a positive code. It would be also subject, and maybe even the category fun. So we had an inductive coding, so found categories that were describing the primary words, and then we clustered it in two different contexts. So here I give you the indoor cluster, and you see it's a very flat cluster, very disconnected, and so we could say something about the context and how the children perceived the teaching in the context. And if you cannot see it because it's too small, but you can see that subject is dominating, and a lot of those are in very light print. That means it's very low emotional connected. So so there's a three-dimensional presentation or representation of what was going on in class. If you look at the outdoor instead, in contrast, you would see a much more hierarchical system, much more connected, and much more bold print with many more positive connotations. So this is one way of using a qual-quant integrated method to represent I call this the semantic context of a teaching lesson. So we know a lot of meaning. So we generate meaning structures by generating hierarchical text structures. I think this is pretty much unproblematic from an epistemological point of view. You could argue, well, this is not capturing the whole story, but this is much more a methodological problem than an epistemological one. It's getting much more interesting when we go one step further, because as it is, I think, very consistently argued, there is a difference in the logic of justification in mixed method approaches. So the qual and the quan traditions follow different logics of justification. So if we want to go a step further, we run into an epistemic problem. If we just stay on the methods and the technique sides, that's just okay. But if we want to go on a justification, then it's interesting. So there is a recent paper that looked at justification strategies of mixed method research. So they analyzed about 1,200 papers published in mixed methods research, and they find three different approaches. So the first thing is, well, as I said, as I say, the meaning of a concept lies in its practical consequences, not in the paradigm. So this is not problematic at all. They call this the aparadigmatic stance. So researchers say, well, we just mix it and it works and it's fine. And I would agree, this is a good strategy as long as you don't go deeper into the traditions. So if you stay on the surface of just using some techniques or some methods, that means some some clusters of techniques. That's a good way to do. But the most people would say, would use a single paradigm stance. So they actually try to justify their stance, and that is, they adopt a philosophical system that is compatible with both the qualitative and the quantitative approaches. So mostly it's critical realism that is cited here, or claim that the applied methods are only loosely connected to the philosophical stance, and which is pretty much the paradigmatic stance, the aparadigmatic stance, I'm sorry. So basically what they're doing is they apply a rather superficial ontology. And the word pragmatic is the most cited, most used word here. I must say I'm a little bit discontent with such a superficial approach, because it doesn't really give you an answer. Just saying it works is just a little bit, yeah, too little for my taste. And then a fraction that say, okay, let's just embrace pluralism and say, okay, we can combine it anyways and see the benefit in the dialectical positions. So you would always have to discuss the different implications of the different stances you take within one paper. I find this a little bit postmodern. Actually, this is, for my taste, a little bit irrational. But well, I'm not against multi-perspective. I'm just saying a consistency in one paper is easier for the reader, and maybe easier for myself as a researcher than to have to switch between positions within one research project, within one workflow. But again, this is pretty common usage, and let people do what they do as long as they argue for their cases. But as codes have found out, it's only about 7 or 8% of all papers that actually are explicit about their justification strategy. So that means that more than 90% just ignore the problematic here. They just go right into the analysis, which I think is problematic, because we have the problem of commensurability, or rather incommensurability. We have this dualism between subjective and objective, between constructivism and realism. And of course, we can add adjectives like critical realism to realism and make it more constructivist. So try to make a middle stance here. Okay, that's an approach. But my point, or my strategy, is a different one. And this is what I'm trying to talk about now. So this was the intermezzo. And now comes my solution. The Bayesian framework. This is beyond paradigms, because Bayesian epistemology shifts the focus from the justification of the true beliefs, the ontology, to the confirmation of degrees of beliefs or credences of the actors. So this is a very smart move made by Bayesians, that they actually leave the problematic of ontology as it be. You can have any sort of belief as long as you can, as long as that what you count as evidence and what you can sell as evidence to the research community can be confirmed in forms of degrees of beliefs. And this is an expression in an interval from 0 to 1. It's quite easy and quite straightforward. So the Bayesian epistemology builds on a probability theory and is strictly formal. So there is no, if you accept that 1 and 1 equals 2, you're already qualified to do Bayesian epistemology. It doesn't need more. It's just that coherence in a yes, it's just the coherence in time that is important to have. And I think this is an intuition most of us would share, at least in science. And in Bayesian epistemology, beliefs are expressed as subjective probabilities. So the notion of subjective probability is crucial here. And those are updated if external evidence, whatever that is, suggests so. So this is expressed in the Bayesian rule, in Bayes' rule. So we hold that our posterior belief, so that's our updated belief, we can say, is proportional or should be proportional to the likelihood of the prior belief. So, so we have a belief, we start out with a belief, we get some evidence, and then we evaluate our prior belief in the light of the new evidence that's coming in. Mathematically, this can be expressed as the posterior is proportional to the likelihood times the prior, or mathematically in the formula you probably all know if you're in the institute you are in. So I don't have to walk you through Bayes' rule. Actually, it was your researchers, Sasha and Jan-Erik Wagenmakers, who have in their online publications taught me how to understand Bayes. And so I'm very much indebted by your institute of actually what I know today. So the posterior is the probability of the parameters given the data. The likelihood is the probability of observing the data given the parameters or the unknowns. The prior is represents the external knowledge about the parameters, and X is the data, and theta is the hypothesis belief, P is the probability expressed in P, X given X. So regardless of the actual state of the world, non-probabilistic degrees of belief yield a lesser epistemic utility than their probabilistic counterparts. This is the core argument here. Expressed differently in my own world, so this is a direct quote. If you're able to kind of express your beliefs of a state of the world in a probabilistic way, say with a probability of 10, 15, 20, 25%, I believe that. This is always better than if you cannot do this. So if you ask someone and say, why do you believe this? And they say, well, I do not know. And then you say, how certain are you that this is the case? And they say, I do not know. It's just a gut feeling. Then those who say, well, I can express this in a probabilistic way. I have an intuition that this is about, true in 3 of 10 cases. This is always better. It's more useful, basically. So better is useful. And there's 4 arguments presented for the dominance of probabilism. The probabilistic worldview, so having the intuition, expressing your beliefs in form of a quantification, is minimizing inaccuracy. So it's maximizing accuracy. We find argumentations that argue it's more plausible to express probabilistic views, beliefs in a probabilistic way. And note here, plausibility versus justification, which would be the ontological expression or counterpart. And the plausibility is much more formal. And there is, and this is so funny, that I'm talking about Dutch book arguments to people who are in Amsterdam. This is basically the foundation of the intuition that if you express the intuition is that we can express our beliefs in forms of probabilistic beliefs, so in numbers between 0 and 1. And if we express beliefs and find evidence, we should not accept, or we should, and we accept the evidence as true. We should not accept it. So that's basically in booking. That means if we make bets that lead to a sure loss of money. So it's very often expressed in betting and money, betting on money. So if you bet on horses, where you know for sure that the way you bet will lose you money, irrespective of the outcome. So if you pay more for the bets than you could possibly get in return, even if your horses win, that would be a Dutch book, and a rational person would not do this. Well, you might argue that a rational person might be a nice person and wants to make the booker richer as a hidden gift. That's fine. I totally agree with that. But in research, we are not betting on horses. So transferred this argument to a research project would be that we find evidence that we cannot ignore, and the evidence makes us reverse our prior beliefs, so update our belief. And the Dutch book argument would say, if we are rational, we do that. And every rationality, so it boils down to a notion of rationality. So that's why this intermezzo is called the rationality in research, because this is the only thing our researchers in the qualitative and the quantitative field needs to buy, that we let ourselves convince, I was trying to speak Norwegian, that we let ourselves convince by new evidence. So this is basically the justification how this works. This is, in a nutshell, a few thousand pages of philosophy of science. So it cannot be as precise, and I cannot deliver the derivations of the proofs. But if you read Sprenger and Hartmann, a fantastic book, which I really recommend, you will find this. So the common ground of qualitative and quantitative research is that in Bayesian epistemology, we avoid the constructivist realist dichotomy. Both worldview works within Bayesian epistemology, and that Bayesian epistemology incorporates the research subjective beliefs in scientific reasoning and avoids the subjective-objective dichotomy. So this is actually the most important point here, that is when we embrace Bayesianism, we are beyond the subjective-objective dichotomy. We may call it transparency, or embrace just the subjective point of view, because the evidence, the objective evidence, is coming in and is weakening our subjective views. So just 2-3 examples of a integrated Bayesian design. I tell you the data collection, it's about how children perceive outdoor teaching. We had one researcher, an ethnographer, in the field for 1 year, following the 2 classes over a whole school year. That's indicated by the many arrows here. So she's doing a lot of ethnographic field notes and school visits and field trips and photo documentation, all what you would call a classical qualitative research project. At the end, interviews with 25 pupils and 4 teachers and the headmistress. And of course, as it is, this is the intervention phase, and the analysis comes later after the data collection. But of course, there's some ad hoc data analysis, adjustment of research questions and stuff during this year. And on the quantitative side, we had a questionnaire for the pupils and the teachers in the beginning, at the end of the school year. And if you look at the data analysis part, so during the first year, the ethnographic fieldwork included writing the memus, which is already an interpretation step, through regular debriefings with the teachers. So you adjust your view on the field, and also formalized expert rounds where the researcher, the ethnographer, corrected her view, tried to find blind spots and stuff. So there's a lot of interpretation already, data analysis going on during the data collection. And then after the quantitative data had been found, so I'm showing you now this little square here in a bit B. There's a systematic post-hoc data analysis, and here it becomes interesting. Because if we take the text material, the qualitative material, we have an inductive content analysis of the text material. And so deriving codes and summing up the many observations. And once that is done, the researcher can inform actually the analysis of the quantification of the quantitative data by including findings from the coding process as the prior information in the Bayesian ANOVAs. And so the only thing the researcher has to do is to quantify her beliefs on certain parameters that are variables in the Bayesian ANOVA and regression analysis. And a very interesting way to do this is informing the R square prior. I give you in a minute what this is. So this is a pretty new prior information that can be used to steer prior expectations in ANOVA and regression designs. But also her findings can inform data imputation. So if this missing at random, or is it missing completely at random, or is it missing not at random. So we have this kind of information because she knows the field. She knows every student who has filled in the questionnaire. She knows the teachers. She knows what's going on in the field. So she can inform us. She can also inform us about item selection. So had the children difficulties with some items filling out the questionnaire, because those were children who were 8, 9, 10 years old. So the researcher actually used 25 minutes, about half an hour, with every student filling in the questionnaires 2 times and asking them, explaining the items. So she knew actually which items were difficult and problematic. So this goes directly into the establishment of the measurement model. And this again, of course, goes into the ANOVA. So we operationalized, we first established the measurement model and then made a composite score to not to have to model the latent variables with so few observations. And of course, this again results from the Bayesian ANOVA and regression informed deductive content analysis by informing the categories. So here comes another information flow into the system, because those findings, or identifying children who were completely or significantly different from their peers, was then again able to look at the text material and find, okay, yes, I haven't seen this in the first place, but now this is interesting to see now. So there's a whole integration and contextualization of those 2 approaches. And so the R2D2 prior is basically a beta distribution, and on the covariance matrix of the regression. And if you control the covariance matrix of the regression, you control the whole regression. So it's basically pretty straightforward. If you say, I expect my variables, my factors, to explain about 10% of the variance in the data, you can express this and control the regression with this. I give you the example. We don't have to walk this through. This is technical details you're much better familiar with than I am. I'm just a user. And if, now this is my last slide, if we had more measurement points in the design, something I regret we have not, we could have even set up a latent growth model and have direct time invariant regressors on the outcome variables. So we have here time invariant. So for example, class or gender would be time invariant on the intercept and the slope parameters of the growth model. And those could be informed by the findings. So we could quantify ethnographic findings, categories, and directly regress them to the outcomes, the quantitative outcomes. But we could also use the prior information or the information from the ethnographic to define the priors for those paths. So there's a lot of possibilities within the Bayesian statistical framework to combine qualitative and quantitative methods. And unfortunately, I've never seen this anywhere performed or published. And I have not had many possibilities to discuss this. So I'm a little bit over time, but very eager to discuss this with you and hope that I can write this paper in some time. Maybe someone wants to help me because I'm notoriously short of time, and maybe some more statistical knowledge would be helpful to making this a really great paper. So thank you very much. I'm trying to get you here.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Yes.
I think we can stop the recording now.